Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 8th of April, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. I'm your host. Welcome to UK Column News, I should say. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. And I'm welcoming David Scott. David, welcome to the programme. How are things in Scotland? How's the weather?
We've got a little bit of sunshine, watery sunshine up here in Perth, and it's been quite mild and pleasant, not too bad at all.
Okay, super. Right. Well, we'll get straight on then. And obviously, the main news of the day is that David Cameron, has come clean. I mean, I have to say, this has been a headline right across the media today that Cameron has come clean. And I find that quite unlikely. What do you think?
I don't think he should use big words he doesn't understand, Mike.
Well, indeed. So apparently, he has profited from his father's offshore fund, and he says that what he did was that he and Samantha a few years ago invested £12,000 in the offshore fund, and they got a return which they saw £30,000 in total return to them, and that was all done and dusted a few weeks before he entered government in 2010. So that is his coming clean. Now, earlier in the week, of course, he's been faffing about with this for days. And earlier in the week, he was speaking in front of an audience, and he said, "In terms of my own financial affairs, I have a salary as Prime Minister, and I have some savings, which I get some interest from, and I have a house, which we've now let out because, of course, he's in number 10. And that's all I have," he said. And well, I've captioned that liar, and actually he was lying, wasn't he? Because of course he has more than one house, but we'll come on to that. And of course, the rent that he receives, the Independent was reporting in January that he had already received £500,000 in rent since becoming Prime Minister. And so let's just break that down a little bit. He gets £143,462 annual salary as PM, plus expenses. He has allegedly a £35 million net worth. Of course, he has two houses and £500,000 rental income, and that's all he has. So that's good.
Well, it's interesting. I was feeling quite sorry for him a few days ago when I heard he's just got his salary and a little bit, and he's managed to put aside and the house, and nothing else. And I was thinking, well, compared to Blair, this is chump change. This you normally you get to be prime minister of this country, and you walk away a multimillionaire and set for life. So I was feeling quite sorry for Mr. Cameron. Was considering having a whip round, but you've reassured me, Mike, that there is in fact enough there that he's not going to be destitute.
Well, there has been a backlash, and we've started seeing this going around Twitter. Calls for Cameron to resign. Now, of course, there was the recent poll online to decide whether he should actually return to the country or not, and that garnered quite a number of thousand signatures. So it's unfortunate that he has come back. But anyway, he's being called on to resign, and this is a gathering at 10 Downing Street, starting on Saturday and ending when he resigns. And it seems like it's mostly Occupy that's behind this. So they're wanting to encourage as many people as possible to get to 10 Downing Street beginning on Saturday and to stay there for as long as it takes. Now, of course, the danger in this type of gathering is that the police may react in a particular way, or there may be a rent-a-mob turns up. If it's the case that people go there and basically quietly make their point, then there's perhaps some use in this. But I hope it doesn't end in tears for some of the people that are there. What do you think?
I'd be quite concerned about that for several reasons. This is not Iceland. Iceland had a mass protest, got rid of the premier over this subject, and did so peacefully and did so in a much smaller community, which came together to say we're not having this. Um, I don't think you can replicate that in the middle of London. You have the risk of violence, and violence will only ever help the state and those who seek to divide and loot us. Um, and what's the follow on from David Cameron resigning? Presumably we get George Osborne.
Well, we do, and this is also doing the rounds of Twitter and so on. Of course, this is a quote, or this is an excerpt from a video clip. He was on the Daily Politics show, and he was giving some advice, some financial advice. He's clearly it's clearly quite a few years ago now, but he said that he was talking to somebody called Bill, who was asking about passing on his property to his next generation. And the one piece of advice I would give Bill, according to George Osborne, was there are some financial products which enable you to pass on your home pass on the value of your home to your son or daughter and get care paid for by the state. So he wasn't too worried before he became Chancellor about people sort of bending the rules, shall we say?
Well, yes, and care paid for by the state. Well, actually, the state doesn't have anything. The state just steals from other people, which is so you're having the care paid for by other people, by their work.
Well, having made contributions all your life, of course.
Perhaps, yes. You're suggesting there that there is some sort of social contract or some sort of quid pro quo with the state. I really don't know if that's the case anymore. I've been unable to pin down just what the deal is we have on offer here.
Indeed, but nonetheless, Osborne's view is that we should make sure that we use offshore shell companies to hide our assets in the meantime. So that's the point there. Now, in the meantime, our Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, is in Hong Kong. Now, of course, Hong Kong, many of the alleged Chinese perpetrators mentioned by the Panama Papers were from Hong Kong. He has gone straight over there to see whether he can build some momentum for a new colour revolution over there. But we should also remember that Hong Kong has historically been the centre, or one of the centres, of drug trafficking and money laundering for drug trafficking, and the Hong Kong-Shanghai Banking Corporation, a key part of that. And you wanted to also point out that Panama is also a centre of this. This is timely because, of course, the United States at the moment is suffering quite broadly from a pretty major heroin epidemic, which has not causing problems to the traditional communities as such, but has gone right into the heart of the American middle classes. And we're seeing people overdosing, dying, committing suicide as a result of heroin addiction, as a result of the incredibly poor economy over there at the moment. So this is a pretty important aspect of this whole thing.
It's huge, and it's vital to understand when you look at somewhere like Panama or indeed Hong Kong, to understand the drugs connection and the wider implications here. Now, this book, which we have covered some considerable time ago in the call, this is the Bible for unpicking all of these links. It's been published since I think way back in the 70s. It's been through several editions, been updated. It names names, it gives you times, it gives you dates, it says who, it says where. What it reveals is that from the earliest intervention into Indochina, the CIA has been a major drug dealer throughout the world. There are huge, strong, and long-lasting links between the drugs trade, between the CIA, and between Wall Street. It's a three-cornered exchange, and essentially what you've got is the CIA selling drugs to American teenagers, getting them hooked on heroin, and using the proceeds to buy guns to run covert operations and unapproved black ops wars all around the world. This book's been published, I say, for a long time. No one's ever sued. No one's ever been able to get the book removed or shut down, and it does name names. It's a very interesting read indeed.
And the other thing to mention is the documentary film, The Panama Deception.
Yes, this was pointed out actually by Alex, put me on the trail of this. A very good documentary. It won the Oscar for documentary filmmaking, and shows just how brutal the American intervention into Panama was. This was at the early point of George H.W. Bush's presidency, when he was trying to shake off the allegation that he was a wimp and show that he was tough and mean and ready for the fight. And they moved into Panama on the flimsiest of grounds, manufactured grounds. They bombed the Panama Defense Force into oblivion, and many residential areas as well were simply razed to the ground and or burnt to the ground. The number of casualties, the Americans claimed it was something like 250, and it runs into the high thousands of civilian deaths. There are well-attested accusations of murder by American troops as well. A really horrific story, and one of the things that comes out of it is the complete blasé and the complete denial by every American official interviewed during this documentary to address the real issues and the real evidence.
Now, of course, following on from that, the whole Panama thing with George H.W. Bush, there was a time where drugs money didn't quite make it as far as Wall Street.
Yes, there was an attempt at one point to cut down on the money laundering going through Wall Street, and this greatly displeased the drugs cartels, because it's a free market. They can launder their drug money in many other places, and they didn't take very kindly to attacks on their cash by the American authorities. So they withdrew their cash from Wall Street for a brief period, and prompted a very significant fall in the entire stock market, and revealed really that the only source of genuine liquid capital going into Wall Street is in fact drugs money. And ever since that, the Wall Street will have been quite clear that they will not seriously threaten the drugs and money laundering interests on which ultimately they depend. And I would also point out, when you look at the CIA links to the drugs industry, which are revealed in that book and are absolutely undeniable, you also have to remember that almost every head of the CIA, if you look at his previous backstory, has in fact been a Wall Street banker. Indeed.
Okay, thanks for that, David. Let's move on. And I'm going to bring this back up. We discussed this yesterday, this whole issue of this cancer drug potentially stopping paedophile urges. And we were pointing out that this is a step along the way to normalizing paedophilia. And I wanted to highlight the RT take on this. And I think ITV News had the same type of headline, paedophiles for chemical castration trial. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this, because it's quite an emotive headline.
It certainly is. I'm concerned by the whole issue that what we're in fact doing is medicalizing evil, medicalizing criminal activity, and rather suggesting that that paedophiles can't help their urges. It's they were born that way, poor them, and we should simply modify society to accommodate in one way or another these unavoidable inbuilt urges. And I don't think we should be accepting that as a society at all. We shouldn't be accepting assaults on children under any circumstances. And while we want to have a situation where these issues can be addressed and not simply hidden forevermore, trying to put them forward as a purely medical problem seems very unwise.
It seems to me, David, we've seen this type of rhetoric before, and that was with regard to the gay community. Now, what I'm saying here is not a comment about or any attempt to sort of equate the two issues here, but there are two key differences. The first difference is the issue of consent, the fact that when we're discussing the issue of gay equality, the issue of consent is a fairly major part of that, and the question is whether children can ever be qualified to offer their consent for this type of activity, and of course they can't. But also there is the issue of the weaponization of minorities and turning minority campaigns into something which is politicized and becomes a political tool. And this is pretty dangerous.
It is, and it was explicitly stated by Gramsci and others that this was how they were going to bring down the West. The Soviet type left-wing and communist revolution having failed to gather enough support, the explanation that they came up with was, well, in Russia it worked because we had a society that was collapsing, and in the chaos of that collapse we could establish a communist state. So what we need to do is we need to cause a similar collapse in the West. So we need to attack everything that glues the West together. So we attack the church, we attack faith, we attack relationships between people in government, we attack relationships between people and their employers, and first and foremost we attack the family. So that was the Communist Manifesto, that was the agenda, and they were explicit about how they would attack the family. They were going to normalise homosexual relationships and other unusual or abnormal relationships. They were going to encourage divorce, they were going to support abortion, and they were going to support and normalise paedophilia. And that last one has been the one that they've found greatest difficulty in doing. But we have to be very watchful for continued attempts to use the same tactics to make paedophilia normal, and through that to further erode the family, which is the basic building block of our nation and our society.
Thank you very much for that. Let's move on. So you wanted to highlight this story once again.
Yes, this is a very sad story. It first came out, and it was a very strange headline. It was a religiously prejudiced attack, which was a strange language, and this was from a Police Scotland press release. And right away you thought, well, actually, this is probably they're searching for a form of words that shows some form of attack by someone within the Islamic community on someone else within the Islamic community, and that's what it turned out to be. So you had this gentleman that's on screen just now, by all accounts, an extremely kind and gentle human being who treated others very well and ran a business in Glasgow and served his community and was absolutely no problem with anybody, and was an asset to the community in which he lived. And he was killed in a violent attack which was motivated by some form of extreme Islamic thought that required murder.
Right. So the BBC take on this was because he disrespected Islam, and the quote that you wanted me to highlight was, "The man accused of murdering Glasgow shopkeeper Asad Shah has issued a statement saying he carried out the killing because he believed Mr. Shah had disrespected Islam. He is accused of killing Mr. Shah outside a shop in Glasgow a fortnight ago," and so on. But this is a disrespectful. Disrespect is the reason for it, apparently.
Well, apparently so. So the point I would like to make here is that fundamentally labels don't matter. Fundamentally, whether or not it's the content of your character that matters. So here you had both a victim and a perpetrator who could be labelled Islamic, and if you go with a casual label and start to judge people based on that label, then you can't really understand what happens here, because the label applies to both, but yet you got the victim who was peaceful, gentle, and treated other people with respect and kindness, and you had the perpetrator who was undertaking a philosophy, or motivated by a philosophy of hatred and murder, and following a path that can only lead to blood and suffering and no peace anywhere. So the labels don't matter. You have to get to know the individuals. You have to be aware that in fact it's the underlying ideas that matter, and those ideas can be toxic, or they can actually be very positive, and you have to get to know the individuals. So it's really a call to say, well, the labels aren't enough. You need to understand where people are coming from. And when you look at the problems that we're having in the UK and in Europe more generally, with Islamic immigration, you have to also see this from the point of view of the British Asian community, who are, I think, at a loss as to understand how to deal with incoming ideas which are toxic, and they can recognise it toxic, which is actually undermining their position in our society and undermining their communities as much as any other part of Great Britain.
And you wanted to highlight this book.
Yeah, this was pointed out by Alex again, so thank you for that. This is a book written by a leader of the sect to which the shopkeeper was an adherent. And he's looking at the changes in Islamic thought that came into Pakistan and is now being exported from Pakistan to the world under the badge of Islam, and which is in fact an extremely toxic set of ideas based on extreme aggression and violence. And this is his, from an Islamic point of view, this is his book opposing these ideas and pointing another way forward. So I think that's certainly worth looking at. And I would say to people who it's worth sitting down and speaking with your Islamic friends about what the implications of all of this are for them and for the wider society. And if you're thinking, well, I don't have any Islamic friends, then I would suggest get some.
Indeed. Okay. Well, what is going on with society at the moment?
Well, we're seeing breakdown in many ways. We're seeing something that is the effects of decades and decades, and indeed in some ways centuries, of moral decay is becoming more and more apparent and can no longer be covered up. And although we're living in a society which is still, despite all the capital destruction and mismanagement of the economy, still very rich, still very affluent, we see so many people in a society being lost, being in a position where there is no hope. It's very, very worrying. Now, this one here, this is the Angela Wrightson murder. So this was the horrific story of two teenage girls from broken homes and being cared for by the state, who, and both known to social services, I would point out, who went out and with enormous callousness and just a horrific disrespect for human life and I mean, evil is the word that comes to mind. Went out and murdered, tortured and murdered a vulnerable adult, also known to social services. So we're seeing here a complete failure of the state to offset any of these, because all of these people were known and the state couldn't do anything to prevent this. They'll come along later on and there'll be some wringing of hands and some reports and some people will go to jail. But at the time, there's no help available. You've got people who are in societies and subcultures that are entirely toxic, with the effects of drugs, the effect of welfare dependency, the effects of lack of good jobs, the effects of all of these problems, and no voice really pointing another way forward. And that's the difference. If you go back to when there was much greater physical deprivation in this country, say if you go back to the 20s and 30s, and there were many, many, many social problems, there was a reaction, and there was more of a reaction from the society at large, be it church organisations, be it things like the temperance movement, which was huge at the time, the Band of Hope, etc. There was a reaction against the social problems of the day, and the reaction came not from social services, not from government, not from top down. It was a bottom-up grassroots campaign, and as such it was much more effective. We seem to have lost the ability to help ourselves.
Well, indeed. Let's move on to economic matters then. I wanted to, I mean, this is a few days old, this story now, but I wanted to start off with this. This is a graph showing the current account deficit of the United Kingdom or of Britain since 1772. And the point that Ed Conway is making here is that at 7% of GDP, Britain's current account deficit is the biggest peacetime shortfall since 1772. Now, current account deficit is basically the difference between imports and exports. And so it really, first of all, makes a complete mockery of the argument that of the Remain campaign, that we would benefit in any way by staying in the EU, or at least that we would suffer in any way if we came out, because we couldn't really be suffering any more than we are already. And as we've said before, the fact of the matter is that the EU is exporting to Britain much more than it is importing from Britain. And so it's not in their interest to suddenly cut off trade deals as soon as we would leave the European Union. But even spokespeople for the City of London are noticing this, and they're calling it the madness of Chancellor George. And this is from a couple of days ago, where Michael Howell is really pointing out the debt trap that Britain is in, and the fact that we are not going to get out of it because we have no money coming into the country which will help us pay the debt. So this is a pretty significant situation we're in, David.
Yes, it is. The idea of an overall trade deficit, there must be a balance. So if we are bringing in goods that we're not paying for by things we make, then we're paying in some other way, and the other way will be assets will be going into foreign ownership, and in no small part, the pounds that we're spending on Chinese consumer goods are coming back into the country and fueling things like housing booms in London and the South East. So we find ourselves priced out of our own marketplace in many regards. So it has all sorts of strange and unforeseen consequences. The free market solution to this should be quite abrupt and direct. It should be an equalisation by price. In other words, the price of the pound should fall, the price of the yen or the renminbi should go up until there is an equalisation. And in that, we would become poorer because we're not producing enough. And then perhaps we would learn our lesson and concentrate on being more efficient and actually productive. But there's no sign of that at the moment. What we're seeing is more debt and more kicking of the can down the road, and none of the structural problems. Do you remember all that talk about rebalancing the economy we had from the Chancellor and from the government after the last election? We're going to rebalance the economy. I never heard anyone explain exactly what rebalance the economy means. There was a suggestion that maybe meant, well, we'll cut the financial sector a little bit. There's not been an awful lot of that going on. But what it should have meant is, of course, government gets out of the way, central banks get out of the way, and we allow ourselves to freely trade and put the economy onto the footing that it needs to be in order to thrive. And that's something that can't be directed. It must be organic. It must be bottom up.
Well, you mentioned productivity, and here we have the latest productivity statistics from the Office for National Lies. Well, in fact, we're seeing this continue to fall. This is the seasonally adjusted production and manufacturing from 2013 to February 2016. Well, that's it is what you can see there. If we look at the index of production, look at how why we're seeing falls in our index of production. We're seeing it mainly in the mining sector. This is from 1997. But what we see is the overall index of production is actually 10% lower than 1997. So we're in a pretty we're really demonstrating what we've done with our productive capability over those decades. And if we compare our gross value add compared to other countries, we find that the UK, the percentage of gross value added by the manufacturing industry in the UK has fallen from what looks like around 23% in 1997 to around 15% today. We see that Germany's value added by productive industry has actually increased over that same period. Japan, well, that's a small decline. We are significantly behind Italy, for example, in terms of the proportion of value added by productive employment. So,
Yes, but
these numbers say it all,
Detroit
don't they,
still ahead
David?
of USA as well on that, which is interesting. The key here is what is defining and driving productivity, right? It's not the fact that our workers work less hard than the Germans. In fact, we probably find that the working hours, etc., in the UK are amongst the highest. Right? What drives productivity is essentially the tools that people have to use. It's investment. Investment drives productivity. Now, if all of our investment goes into Southeast housing boom, some quite dodgy paper investments and funneling money to Panama, then it's hardly surprising that our productivity doesn't actually hit the heights, because what you need in order to generate that productivity is the latest plant, the latest equipment. We talked last week about the problems in the steel industry. You have a plant in South Wales losing £1 million a day, and I would expect that you would find that would be far from the most efficient, far from the latest investment, far from the latest equipment in that plant, because you're not getting the levels of investment going in, because the money and the funds and the capital structure is being used elsewhere and being skewed by some very serious incentives which promote some quite unhelpful and toxic behaviour throughout the country, where we are encouraging malinvestment. We're not encouraging investment.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Baltic Dry Index again, because this is a subject we've covered quite a bit in the past. You wanted to start off with the Skyscraper Index.
Yes, the Skyscraper Index is quite interesting. The Skyscraper Index was sort of started off as a joke when someone noticed that there is a correlation between every time you have the tallest building is just finished off, then the world economy takes a nosedive. And isn't that a strange correlation? It goes right the way back to the 30s, because the Empire State Building, when it was completed at the depth of the 1930s Great Depression, and wasn't actually fully let for many, many years thereafter. So you have this correlation going right the way back, and there is a reason for it, because very tall buildings are expensive in terms of cost per square foot. And they only make sense when you've got a very high value real estate market that signifies a bubble. So they tend to get built as the bubbles are inflating and are nearing the top. But because they take quite a long time to complete, by the time they're finished, it's often a point where the market is in fact heading downward rapidly. So when you see the tallest building the record being broken, you know to head for the hills and await for the financial crash.
On the other hand, it does give bankers that have lost lots of money somewhere to jump off.
Well, this is true. It's a long way down from these very, very high buildings. It gives you a chance to think about your decisions.
But the Baltic Dry Index at an all-time low, according to The Economist, and The Economist is apparently explaining this.
Well, yes, this is a slightly older article. The Baltic Dry Index has come up a little bit since this, but this was a few months back when it was at an all-time low, and they're suggesting that the issue was, in fact, too many ships. It's not that the world economy is in a mess. No, they were just building too many ships that were laid down during the boom time. And are now coming online, but because there's so many of them were laid down, we now have too many. This is rather missing the point. The point is, again, malinvestment. The point is the problems come from the boom. The problems don't come from a bust. The bust is the normal free market response to try and correct the malinvestments that happened in the boom. So you had a boom, an abnormal boom in moving iron ore to China, so that we could have structural steel manufactured to build apartments that no one can afford and sit empty in various parts of China. That's a strange and abnormal situation. And yes, we put a lot of investment as a world into building large bulk ore carriers to make that happen. Now we're having to live with the effects of that, because that malinvestment is in there. The capital structure is locked in. You can't suddenly take a ship and make it into a car or a sewing machine or a washing machine. It's locked into being a ship, and it takes a lot of new capital investment to change that ship into something else. So it's not the capital is just money and it's all fungible, it can be moved around. The capital structure is made up of real things: factories, ships, docks, infrastructure, roads, bridges, all of these things. And if they're in the wrong place, if they're serving the wrong markets, the effects last a long time. Those malinvestments need to be liquidated, they need to be flushed out of the system, and that requires a recession. The problem is, for political reasons, recessions are no longer acceptable. So central banks are doing everything they can to put this off. So nothing is being fixed. The long-term trend is clearly downwards, but we are being told that we're living in a time of recovery. It's a very strange-looking recovery. Nothing's been fixed. All the problems remain, and as a result, the recovery looks very like the way recessions used to look.
But that article was from some time ago, but still the Baltic Dry Index is bouncing along the bottom.
Yes, 500 points is hardly stratospheric. Yes, this is a very upbeat article. Hey, we hit 500 points, but we were at 11,000 a little while ago. So
yeah, they're still below. They're still below they're still running below their cost of operation. Yes. So, and the commodity situation isn't improving either.
No, and this is copper's a good proxy for the world economy. It's an industrial metal. It's used in electronics industry, for example, very widely, and it tends to correlate quite well with overall economic activity. So that's an interesting chart. You see there the big dip. That was a Great Recession, and it was a recovery. And since that recovery, since 2011-12, it's just been heading down and down and down. That is not what a recovery looks like.
No, not by any standard. And another book plug, because you want to plug Jim Rickards' new book.
Yes, I haven't read Jim Rickards' new book. It's currently Amazon are currently making it winging its way to me as we speak. But Jim Rickards is always worth a listen. He's extremely insightful and analytical as he looks at economic matters. And he's put out the new case for gold. Now this updates the case for gold, which you also see on the screen, which dated from 1975 and was written by Ron Paul and others, and was the minority report to the United States Commission on Gold. This was when the Reagan administration came in, they set up a commission. Obviously, didn't want to make a decision. So what do governments do? Oh, we'll have an inquiry. They set up an inquiry into the possibility of going back onto the gold standard. The majority of that inquiry felt that it wasn't the right thing to do, but a minority felt that it was, and they put forward this minority report, which subsequently became a book and a bit of an underground bestseller, to put the case for gold. Now, what Jim Rickards has done is he's updated this and brought out, not only has he demolished the current, the common arguments you hear that there's not enough gold to run the world economy, gold has no dividend, no return, and things like this. Not only does he go through and address all of these common arguments against gold, but he looks at things from a 21st century perspective. There are things that we are now living with that in 1975 were simply unthinkable. You could not imagine a zero interest rate policy, let alone a negative interest rate policy. You could not imagine the amount of money printing that's been going on, or central bank manipulation that's been going on, the risks that come from things like the derivatives market. So there's a whole lot of 21st century issues that were never addressed in 1975, could not be imagined in 1975. So what Jim Rickards is doing here is bringing the case for gold up to date.
Okay, look, we're into our last 5 minutes or so. Let's talk about Nippy and her relationship with China.
Well, there's been a secret deal done, and we're all very surprised to find out there's a £10 billion secret deal with Chinese companies that was made a little while ago, but was kept secret from the Scottish people and the Scottish Parliament, and presumably was going to be revealed after the election, but news got out. And they've had this heads of agreement, and apparently there's going to be huge Chinese investment into Scotland in ways not specified, for projects not specified, and for remuneration not specified. So there's lots of information not specified.
That's an interesting photograph. Is Nicola Sturgeon qualified to sign these documents?
Well, yes, this is a question. I mean, we have here obviously the saltire and the Chinese flag. So there's obviously some sort of national deal being done here, but it's only a devolved parliament, and they can't actually enter into international agreements. So that would seem to be strange, and perhaps just a little bit of over egging it for the photo op, because the deal was not with the Chinese government, of course. The deal was with Chinese companies, one of which, it transpires, has a somewhat doubtful reputation.
No.
I kid you not. Have we got that in the next slide, maybe?
No, I'm sorry that we
No,
don't. So you better
no,
just tell us
okay,
about it.
let me just quickly summarise that. Then one of the companies that we made this £10 billion deal with, Transpire, was well known to the Norwegian National Sovereign Wealth Fund, and had been they were looking at investing in the same company, and then decided not to because of the vast amount of corruption they were being involved with. But that's apparently no problem in Scotland, because we didn't know about it, and that's okay.
Oh, okay then. Right, in a closing minutes then, let's just bring us up to date with named person. And there's been a by-election.
Well, yes, there's been a little bit. We've wondered for a while when this would start to show in the political world, and we've been getting there steadily. For about a year, we've been seeing people writing that they used to be members of the SNP. They used to be SNP voters and will never vote for them again, or they used to be SNP members and they've written to the SNP, resigned their membership, and cited the named person as the reason. So people do feel strongly about individual liberty and the fact that the state shouldn't be running everyone's family, and that's been happening on a personal level. But when would it ever show in the broader economic field? So the first slide we got there is a little note from the Herald of a poll, and if you look down here, what it says is that the SNP poll ratings have dropped. They say almost 10, but actually it's 8%. It was at 55%, which is stratospherically high, to be fair, and it's dropped back to 47%, which is still a clear win, but it is quite a sizable downward move. So I wondered if that might be the sign of maybe things moving a little bit. We then got a local election, which we've got the results from here. This is Armand and Erne ward in my own area, Perth and Kinross. And we see the Conservatives up 18.4%. Now, Conservatives, as you know, in Scotland are campaigning very hard against the named person scheme. The Nationalists are down, Labour's down, Lib Dems are down. UKIP, who are also against named person, were up a little bit. All the Labour standing there for the first time.
So sorry, David, do you think that this result is a direct consequence of campaigning around the named person scheme?
No, I wouldn't put it that highly. And clearly those numbers don't entirely add up. So there's been someone who's presumably an independent who's no longer standing. But I think it is interesting to see. And there are several other qualifications. That's a rural Perthshire area. It would have been traditionally Conservative voting in the past anyway. And perhaps the SNP wanted to hit the high point of their support after the independence referendum. But 18.4% is still a big swing in anyone's book. And named person is playing quite heavily on the doorsteps. So it's part of, not the whole reason, but it's part of a movement away from the SNP, and it's showing some signs of a political consequence to trying to roll out the most totalitarian act ever written in the English language.
So are the SNP getting a bit nervous about this? Is that what's behind this particular tweet? Because it says SNP candidate in Edinburgh East Hustings tonight said there would be an opt-out of named person, or is this just continuing the nippy lie that we were covering last week?
Well, it can't be the nippy lie. It has to be a new lie, because Nippy, of course, said that there was no requirement to opt in, that it was entirely voluntary, and there was no coercion and it wasn't mandatory at all. And in fact, the named person would only be involved if you asked them to. If you or your child asked for advice, you get advice. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing anything, which is, of course, completely incorrect, absolutely against what the Act says and the statutory guidance says, and and a barefaced lie, essentially. But now we're seeing the SNP talk about an opt-out. Maybe we'll see. They might introduce an opt-out into the manifesto, which is due to be launched next week. This is the first suggestion of something like that. So we'll need to watch them quite carefully to see what they actually offer. But perhaps it's the start of some political caving in on this subject. And they have to find a way out. From a political point of view, this is a disaster for the SNP. If it's not thrown out by the Supreme Court, it will ultimately end up in massive civil disobedience, and it will simply never go away as an issue. So they have to find a way out politically. So we should watch for them trying to do something. But whether it will be genuine, whether it will actually be pro-family and pro-liberty, or whether it will simply be some window dressing, we'll need to see.
Well, what has Unison been discovering in their health visitor survey?
This is another very interesting area. The Unison represent the health visitors. And of course, these are the people who are going to be named persons, or one group of the people who are going to be named persons. And they had a survey. How do you feel about this? And 52% of the health visitors, so 52% of the people who will be named person, said they thought it was a bad idea and would actually make situation worse, not better. And amongst the comments, I particularly liked one health visitor who said that I would feel I had lost all right as a parent. That is a personal view. Difficulty implementing it, implementing the scheme, difficulties regarding movement of people and homelessness and migrants. So they're saying that as a parent, they would feel that they had lost all their rights. And that's a health visitor who's a named person looking into this scheme. So we're seeing Unison reflecting the views of their members, which is there are huge problems with this. It doesn't work. We're not happy, and we don't want to do it. 52% think it's a bad idea. So if you can't even convince people you're paying to be named person that named person's a good idea, then the proposal is clearly toiling.
I thought this was quite interesting because apparently you and everybody campaigning against no to name person, or anybody campaigning against the name person scheme, you're either nutter Christians, nutter libertarians, or nutter Christian libertarians.
Yes,
which one are you, David?
I think I'm all three. This is a person who said, I'll read the whole thing, it's just worth pondering. My job involves name person implementation. So this is a senior council official, I take it from that. Probably Dundee from the description. It is a far more sensible system, having one point of contact and one plan and one set of records for child health, social work, education, community work. So they don't all have their own records and they don't speak to each other and things getting missed. So it's bureaucratically tidy. The bureaucrat loves this. You know, we can't have any nasty, messy liberty. That wouldn't do at all. Right? It then goes on to say almost every tragedy the investigation shows the child and family had contact with multiple agencies. Information wasn't shared and chances to intervene missed. Now that's half true. Information was shared. So in almost every case, so this is admitting the idea that the problem is children falling through the cracks, going through the gaps in the net, right? Not being identified. That's rubbish. That's just not true. This person here admits it. Almost every tragedy, the investigation shows that the child and family had multiple contacts with multiple agencies. Now, the next bit, it says information wasn't shared. That's not true. Information is shared all the time. Chances to intervene were missed. That's true. What happens is the actual lack of effective action, and the scheme, of course, does nothing for that. And then goes on to say that we're all nutters. And that shows a disregard for libertarian thinking or people who have different political views, a disregard for people who have different religious views, and really would suggest that that particular human being should not, in fact, be given this job, be allowed to work with children, and be allowed to implement this legislation at all.
Indeed. And we'll just end today's news with this.
Yes, I think that sums it up beautifully.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much for joining us, David, and thanks for everybody who's watched live. If you don't watch us live, if you watch us on the archive, do try to join us and try to join in with the chat box. There's been lots of interesting discussion going on today. Well, I hope you all have a good weekend, and we'll see you at the same time, 1 p.m. on Monday. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.